I'd like to welcome everyone, and we'd like to thank you very much for choosing to participate in the Regenerative Organic Certifications Pilot Program. You are all leaders, and we honor your commitment. We are projecting a slideshow on screen, so hopefully all of you are able to log in on video as well as audio. If you haven't done so already, please check your email box for the instructions on how to join in online using the link to Blue Jeans. So let's get started. This webinar will discuss the stakeholders that are involved in the Regenerative Organic Alliance, the Regenerative Organic Certification Program, and the pilots. We'd also like to cover the changes to the Regenerative Organic Certification Guidelines that were published since last September. We'll get into the specifics about the pilot program and the process for going through the pilots, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end. Now I'd like to discuss just a couple of logistics. As I said, we are projecting a presentation online, so hopefully you've joined in online. We'll be sending that out after the webinar to everyone. We've also placed everyone on mute, and we've done this to minimize disturbances. So we respectfully ask that you not unmute yourselves, and also that you turn off video feed. I don't know that anyone's projecting video, but if you were intending to do so, let's not do that today so that we minimize disturbances. Instead, we invite you to use the chat feature, which is over on the far right of the screen. If you click on that button, you can feel free to chat in your comments and questions, and we will leave time for question and answer and discussion at the end today. I also want to let everyone know that we're recording this webinar so that we can share it with any participants who weren't able to join today, and also because we want to be able to respond to your questions individually afterward. And so we'll be recording the proceedings and get back to you individually if we're not able to address your questions during the Q&A. I also understand for some people there might be just a slight delay in the slides advancing. So please bear with us if that happens. We'll be sending this presentation out afterwards. So we should be looking at a slide that goes into some of the objectives for the session today and the participants. As I mentioned, we're going to discuss all of the stakeholders involved in the Regenerative Organic Alliance, the certification program, and the pilot. And then we'll be discussing the specifics of the pilot program in just a little while. Our objectives today are for each of you as participants to understand all of the individuals involved in the pilot, the companies and their roles, also the steps that you as a pilot participant will need to take to prepare for the pilots and how the process will unfold. We want to discuss with you how to communicate about Regenerative Organic Certification and the pilot. We'll be providing you with a list of contacts in case you have any questions or concerns that come along as we move forward with pilots. And then we'll be getting into some immediate next steps on this journey. All right, I do see we have just a slight delay in the slides here. So I'd like to move into the Regenerative Organic Alliance slide, please. And I also see there are several folks still joining us. So again, I just want to let those new folks on the call today know that we are projecting online. So hopefully you've logged in using the Blue Jeans link. And we are recording this so that we can get to any questions or comments afterward if we don't have time during the Q&A. We do ask that those of you who've just joined keep yourselves on mute and instead use the chat feature at the right of the screen here. You can click on that button and chat in your comments or questions, and we will address those later. All right, you should all be seeing a slide here that describes who the Regenerative Organic Alliance is, and that is the governing body that it has helped to create and is now managing the standard. So I'd like to introduce one of the pioneering leaders of the Regenerative Organic Alliance and also a board member. Her name is Rose Marcario. I believe most of you know who she is, but just to give you a little bit of background, Rose is the CEO of Patagonia, the outdoor company dedicated to environmental activism, responsible production, and sourcing. And the company also recently expanded into food with the Patagonia Provisions brand, which I believe many of you are familiar with. And this further extends their positive impact, especially in the area of agriculture. So with that, I'd like to welcome Rose.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm representing our great board here, a number of who are on the call, including Jeff Moyer, the chair of the Rodale Institute, David Bronner from Dr. Bronner's, Will Harris from White Oak Pastures, and I think Paul Dolan from Demeter. And if there's anyone else on the call from our board who I didn't mention, I apologize, but we're really excited to have you kick off this webinar. This initiative is focused on bringing together the best science on regenerative organic practices with the best practices for social fairness and animal compassion. We want to strengthen and develop further the USDA organic seal. And so I hope you'll think of this as a kind of innovation lab, as holding the highest bar and bringing together the best practices, the best producers and brands, ranches and farms, and the best thinking to make a better world through agriculture. So thank you, everyone on this call. You are pioneers, and I want to thank you for being with us today. And I'm going to turn it back over to Nova because you have a lot of material to cover today. And I know if David and Jeff want to say anything further, I'm going to pass that off as well.
Thank you, Rose. David or Jeff, would you like to say any words before we move into the pilot process?
This is David. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Just really excited to see the pilot here launch. It's an amazing roster of brands and farms we got. It's basically combining the best of the soil health, animal welfare, and fair trade and labor movements into a single certification. We feel this is going to really be a game changer in the market, and I'm just really excited to really crush this pilot phase with everybody. But ground truth the standard, provide feedback, make sure we have a really optimized standard when we hit the ground running next year. So right on. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Jeff, and this is Jeff Moyer. I want to agree with Rose and David that this is an exciting opportunity for all of us, both in the production side and in the processing and marketing side, to showcase the power and the energy that organic agriculture can have when it really lives up to its full potential. So we're excited to be part of this. Excited to have all of you engaged at this level, and look forward to working with you over the course of the expansion of this program as we roll it out. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Jeff. So folks, as you can see here, we've got some really important leaders involved in the Regenerative Organic Alliance. And interestingly, many of them are actually also participating in the pilot through their own farm supply chains. So we have strength in numbers. And with that, I'm going to move forward and describe some of the other stakeholders who are involved in the Regenerative Organic Certification Program. So that gives me an opportunity to introduce NSF International, myself and my colleagues. For those of you who are not familiar with NSF, we are a global not-for-profit organization with a mission to protect public health and the environment. NSF has dedicated a team of experts to this Regenerative Organic Certification Program, and I'd like to introduce each of us. You can see our names there on the screen. Think of us as a resource for you as you move through this pilot process. From the NSF Standards Group, we have Jessica Evans, the director, whom I believe each of you have already communicated with. We also have Jessica Slomka, the manager of the Center for Sustainability Standards. And from our Sustainability consulting team, we have Brittany Skipanick. She's a senior project manager. Also Diana Bach, a project analyst, and Hannah Weatherford, an associate project analyst. And my name is Nova Sayers. I connected with the founders of the Regenerative Organic Alliance, nearly 2 years ago now, through our shared goal to promote regenerative organic agricultural practices. So please think of all of us from NSF as a resource. But as you can see here, there are two primary contacts who we invite you to reach out to. That is Jessica Slomka and Jessica Evans, and their emails are up on screen. And of course, you'll be hearing from them through email and phone calls as we continue down this journey through the pilots. You might also be contacted by others on this team with some specific questions if needed, but please think of our Jessicas as your primary resource. Now, a little bit about NSF's role. We are the independent program manager for the Regenerative Organic Certification. So we're an independent entity separate from the Regenerative Organic Alliance. And we will be directly managing the pilots, which includes creating guidance materials for each of you and all the participants involved. Also selecting and training the certification bodies and documenting all of the learnings that we glean from these pilots so that we can recommend changes to the Regenerative Organic Alliance board to help to improve upon the standard prior to the full launch of this program in 2019. And that's when we expect to begin actually certifying products in the marketplace. So I just want to point out that NSF is an independent program manager separate from the Regenerative Organic Alliance, and that helps to maintain the integrity of the program on a global scale. Now let's move on to talk a bit more about the details of the program. And for that, I'd like to invite Phil from Patagonia to join us.
Thank you, Nova. So everybody, first of all, thank you so much. We were thrilled to have over 80 operations and brands enthusiastically raise their hands to apply for the ROC pilot. And I personally want to thank the 21 pilot organizations that are represented here today on the line for taking this leadership position and joining an incredibly important movement. The ROA board and I wholeheartedly believe that regenerative organic agriculture can help solve some of the biggest social and environmental challenges that we face today as society. So thank you so much for joining us on this regenerative organic journey. So you can see here the pilot participants that are listed out. We are incredibly proud of the slate of all-star operations and brands that we've convened for this pilot. And one of the biggest goals for the pilot process is to collect feedback from you and implement those changes into the ROC framework and the certification process itself. So if you do have feedback or learnings as you undergo this pilot process, please relay them directly to one of the Jessicas at NSF. We'll share the deck with the materials after, and please feel free to share that feedback and know it'd be warmly welcome on our end. Next slide, please. Okay, here we look at the ROC framework's progression over time. Just a little bit of history. So back in early 2017, we surveyed the landscape of existing certifications with our collective goal to create a new high-bar holistic certification that is actually achievable. So as part of this process, we interviewed dozens of farmers and ranchers and farm workers, experts in social fairness and animal welfare. And then we synthesized all of this information into a single document, which was released for public comment back in September 2017. We were then blown away by the level of interest in ROC, the public comments that came in. We sorted through over 400 public comments, and we were thrilled to see that those were coming from farmers and ranchers, soil scientists, brands, very diverse stakeholders had an opinion and point of view about each of these individual facets of ROC. So the board deliberated over each and every one of these 400 comments and updated the ROC framework as appropriate. Then back in May of this past year, we published the pilot-ready framework, which you can find on the ROC website, www.regenorganic.org. And because of all these comments, ROC, as it stands today, is far better than it was in September 2017. And the board and I both agree that as a result of this pilot process and incorporating the feedback and recommended changes from the pilot participants, from the certification bodies, that ROC will continue to be much improved over time. So thank you in advance, again, for your feedback on this pilot process. Okay, the next slide. All right, here we outline some of the general requirements for ROC. And one of the takeaways is that ROC leverages existing certifications like USDA Organic for soil health, Agricultural Justice Project for fair labor, Certified Humane, for example, for animal welfare. And because ROC leverages these existing certifications, it helps streamline the certification process. It makes it as frictionless as possible for the farmer, for the rancher, and it ultimately keeps costs down because we fully recognize that farmers are getting squeezed and profitability at the farm level is something that's incredibly important. So we've cut costs in every area that we could through this certification process without compromising the integrity of ROC being a high bar certification. One of the other requirements for ROC is a regenerative organic system plan, which addresses soil health, animal welfare, and social fairness. So these will be crafted during the pilot process if they are not already in place. We also worked very diligently to simplify the certification criteria. And what you'll see as you go through the most recent ROC framework is that the practices move from optional to required as an operation progresses from ROC bronze to ROC silver to ROC gold. We also looked at the farm level certification, and the board has elected for the supply chain to have a farm level certification be required. And then if a operation or brand is going for gold, that would include farm level certification and also one or more processing steps in the supply chain. ROC also permits group certification, and the board is elected to approach with a square root sampling methodology. And the ROA board is also elected to follow the NOP's pre-existing requirements for chain of custody and labeling. So the takeaway for all of this is that where there are best practices set by NOP and other standards and certifications, we want to leverage those. We don't want to duplicate work. And if a practice is solid, then we have the approach of if it's not broken, don't fix it. So we leverage those existing practices that are in place for all of these general requirements that you see here on this slide. Okay, let's transition to the next one, soil health. All right, as I mentioned, the USDA organic certification is really the foundational requirement for ROC's soil health module. We would also like to point to Demeter Biodynamic and Natureland's Standard on Production as being great first steps that contain many regenerative practices, but ultimately for an operation or brand to have an ROC certified product, it must have a USDA organic certificate or its internationally recognized equivalent. And then here in points 2 through 7, we outline some of the key changes to the soil health module that resulted from the public comment period. So we have listed things like cover crops are a requirement. If you're going to go for gold, one of those cover crops needs to be a nitrogen fixer. For crop rotations in point 3, we have elected a 3-year rotation for bronze and silver levels and a 7-year rotation for the gold level. Tillage was a practice area where we received a lot of public comments on, and at the end of the day, we learned that it's very regional. So the tillage guidance is to till as little as possible and keep it under 10 inches unless you're doing something like ripping out an orchard and putting in a new orchard. And of course, gold includes a higher tillage requirement, or actually lower tillage, I should say, a higher bar, which calls for minimal disturbance over the soil and a 1 tillage pass every 3 years allowance. We also adjusted the requirements for imported fertilizers, pesticides, and GMOs. One call out here is that GMO 2.0s, things like CRISPRs, are explicitly prohibited in ROC, regardless of where they shake out in other certifications. And then last, hydroponic and container growing operations, where crops are never integrated into the field, are both ineligible for ROC. Okay, let's shift to the next slide. Okay, soil testing. We have found that this is going to ultimately be incredibly important to show that regenerative organic practices improve soil health and sequester carbon, which are some of the biggest goals of the program. The board has required testing the first year to establish a baseline, because it's important to know where an operation is starting out in terms of soil health, and then test the soil every 3 years thereafter, because one of our key learnings is that it does take years to improve the health of the soil. It's not something that you can make a dramatic change in a few weeks or a few months. So one test performed during the baseline period, which for everyone on this call would be during the pilot over this next 12-month period, and then you test your soil every 3 years thereafter. One of the things that we really wrestled with was what should ROC test for, because soil health has different definitions to different people. So part of the journey on our end was to interview dozens of soil scientists and experts in soil health, and we found 16 key soil health indicators that most everyone would point back to. Some of those are listed here on the right in the slide. The comprehensive set of the 16 soil health indicators can be found in the appendix of the ROC framework, which again is on regenorganic.org's website. And ultimately, the reason that we're doing this is to capture all these soil health tests and then input them into a database that will, over time, show which regenerative practices by region, and the regionality is incredibly important, correlate to improved soil health. So that's the end game with the soil testing approach. Next slide. Okay, on to animal welfare. So just like the soil health module leverages USC Organic as a baseline, the animal welfare module requires an existing certification. And the important call out here is that if your operation does not have animals, then you don't need to undergo the animal welfare module. So it's not applicable for you. So for example, if you just have row crops, no animals, or mangoes, no animals involved in the operation, the animal welfare module is not applicable. How we generally approach the animal welfare module was to follow the 5 freedoms of animal welfare. Those are freedom from hunger and thirst, freedom from discomfort, pain, injury, or disease, freedom from fear or distress, and freedom to express normal behaviors. So just like the soil health module, we reviewed each and every comment that came in and then tuned the animal welfare requirements to comply with those 5 freedoms that I just walked through, but still keep animal welfare a high bar and achievable standard. So for example, we refined the grazing requirements to ensure regular movement that is best in class for animal welfare and also builds soil health. You can see here in point 2 that we updated the feeding requirements, and the details are listed here. And then we also learned that some things like on-farm slaughter, for example, while they are the preferred method, in some instances they can be prohibitively expensive or infeasible in certain regions where it's not allowed. So you may have to use this slaughterhouse. You cannot do on-farm slaughter. So in that instance, instead of making on-farm slaughter required, we point to it as a recommended practice, but we did have the flexibility to account for, yes, in certain regions, it's just not doable. Okay, let's transition to social fairness, the next slide, 11. Okay, similar to soil health and animal welfare, for social fairness, we do require an existing certification. And if on the phone you currently lack a fairness certification, that's okay. NSF and the board can help point you to an existing certification that would be a good fit for your operation. Some of the key updates to the social fairness module are laid out here. For example, the living wage calculation has been refined and specified to represent a single adult without children. And then we also heard from many farmers and ranchers that higher working hours in some seasons are required. So for example, during harvest period, maybe there are instances where going above a 60-hour work week makes good sense. And so the board has heard that feedback and is open to it. At the end of the day, ROC will have a certification that is greater than or equal to the requirements of your existing certification, but we do want to ensure that the feedback that we've heard in terms of seasonality of harvest, those things are reflected in standard that is implementable on the ground and realistic. And then finally, in the social fairness module, we further outline some best practices for things like worker housing, organized labor, and long-term commitments. All right, let's jump to slide 12. This is an important one where we look at the existing certifications that are recognized by ROC. Great. So the intent, as I mentioned earlier, is to leverage and build upon the good work that has already been done by the organizations that you see listed here. We do need to note that ROC is a high bar certification, and there are gaps that represent additional requirements beyond these existing certifications that must be met before achieving ROC. So for example, if we look at soil health, USD Organic is the baseline, the foundational certification that is leveraged for that module. But as I talked about in some of the earlier slides, ROC goes beyond that to look at regenerative practices. So it has more guidance on things like tillage, which could be absent from USD Organic. So the aim of these bolt-on requirements or incremental requirements with ROC is to improve soil health and sequester carbon for the soil health module. And then the same holds true for the animal welfare and the social fairness modules. We surveyed each of the existing certifications, crafted ROC's framework, but then depending on your starting point for each of these individual certifications, you will have a handful of gaps to address. And that's really the focus of the audits that are part of this pilot process. Again, as I mentioned in one of the first slides, we feel that this equivalency process really helps avoid duplication, so you're not going to be auditing the same things twice. It streamlines the audit process, and also a really important point is that it keeps costs down because you're only auditing to the gaps between these existing certifications. The equivalency documents, which lay these out and show ROC's bolt-on requirements for every recognized existing standard, which are listed here on slide 12, will be available this month. Okay, let's move to slide 13. On scope of pilot, so the board worked very hard with NSF to seek out diversity, both in terms of geographic location, size of operation, product type, etc. So geographically, as you can see here, the pilots are occurring in 8 U.S. states, as well as Canada, Brazil, Ghana, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Sri Lanka, India, and Cambodia. We've also been pleased that we have good representation from small farms, which we categorize as less than 100 acres. We also have good representation from mid-sized farms, which are between 100 and 1,000 acres, and large farms as well. So we have it all, small, medium, large, across the globe. And then products, diversity in product types. Some of those are listed here: dairy, fruits and vegetables, grains, meat, cotton, legumes, herbs. And the one that I'm most excited about is wine. I've got to say, my wife and I are particularly keen to sample some of Bonterra's regenerative organic wine that'll be available at the end of the pilot period, and it'll be a lot of fun. So I'll land it there on my slides. Again, I want to personally thank you for participating with us on this journey. I was leaving the house today, and my 3-year-old was asleep, and I was just looking at her, kind of doing some self-reflection to prepare for this webinar, and decided that, ultimately, a successful ROC pilot and ROC launch is the greatest thing that we can do for her future and all of our kids. So it's incredibly important. It's an honor to participate on this journey with you, and we thank you so much for your partnership. So with that, I'll hand the baton to Jessica Evans, who's going to speak a bit about the goals for this pilot. Over to you, Jessica.
Thank you, Phil, and hello, everyone. So as Phil and Nova mentioned, the ROC pilot is a learning process, and the framework itself is a living document. That is why it is so important that we have your feedback throughout the pilot journey. I'd like to talk about the 4 main goals over the next several months. The first being testing the framework and the requirements on the ground in a variety of different regions and product categories through on-site audits, corrective action response, and training and education of the farms and pilot participants. Next is collecting feedback from all that are involved in the supply chain, certification bodies, the producers, and at the farm level. And this feedback is going to lead to refining the guideline itself, improving certification, and improving the overall audit process. The next goal is, after we receive all of this feedback, we will look to update the ROC framework and the overall certification program. We'll use these learnings to create a certification that is both practical and scalable, while we're leveraging existing standards to build on current best practices. And finally, launching the full ROC program in 2019 with certified products. We would love to have everyone certified by the end of the pilot, but certification is not required. As we have mentioned before, this is a learning experience, and producers have very different needs and situations. So some of you may not be able to achieve certification immediately, and that's okay. For those producers, the pilot will determine how far along the regenerative organic certification journey you are, and what specifically is needed for ROC certification in the very near future. Next, I wanted to go over the timeline over the next several months. So over the past few weeks, I've had the pleasure of connecting with most of you, and I look forward to speaking with the rest of your team soon. For the remainder of the month, we'll be focusing primarily on scheduling training modules for the 3 pillars: soil health, social, and animal welfare. And this will be an opportunity to talk a little bit more about specific training materials and identify needs in those 3 areas for the pilot program. Over the next 2 weeks, we would like to ask you to review the current ROC framework in great detail and begin implementing the regenerative practices. In late August and early September, I will be coordinating calls with all of you and the certification bodies that will be conducting the ROC pilot audit. We've highlighted before that collecting feedback from the participants is extremely important throughout the process. Please be on the lookout for our first touchpoint survey that we will be sending out in September. We will also be focusing on onboarding and training of the certification bodies in preparation for the ROC pilot audit and scheduling of the on-site audits as well in September. October through December, the ROC pilot audits will be conducted, and we'll be collecting that significant feedback from all of you and the certification bodies to refine the ROC framework, finalize the tools in development, and improve training materials to support a successful launch in March of 2019. So certification bodies. We've had the opportunity to speak with several certification bodies, and there are 5 core certification bodies that we've identified on the left-hand side. There's definitely an opportunity to work with your existing certifiers as well. And if they are listed as a core certification body, then we are already in conversation with them about exploring adding the ROC requirements to the scope of their audit. If your certification body is on the right side of the slide, we'd love to speak with you and your certification body to see if they're interested in auditing specifically to the ROC bolt-on. Or the other option would be to use one of the CBs we've already begun working with and to have them conduct your pilot audit. Remember, the pilot audit would only cover the ROC bolt-on and not the full organic or other standard certification. Our ultimate goal is to get as many certification bodies on board as possible. So how and when are certifiers trained on these bolt-ons? NSF will lead the training of the certification bodies on these gaps and bolt-ons. Training is already in development and will be conducted through September and on an ongoing basis. One of the most important things as a program manager is ongoing training and education, because we want to make sure that it provides the most value to our auditors as well as our certification customers. Some of the materials that we are developing for the certification bodies include audit checklists, auditor interpretation guidelines, communication templates, and online webinars. So for example, let's say an operation is certified USDA Organic, Global Animal Partnership for an Agriculture Justice Project. Who performs the ROC specific requirements, and what are the ROC specific costs? There will be one certification body that does all of the bolt-ons for the pilot. And going forward, NSF will train the module-specific certification bodies to add on when they conduct their individual audits. NSF will work with each of you to determine the best certification body to conduct your pilot audit in our upcoming calls between the NSF team, all of you, the pilot participants, and the certification body. We'll be reaching out to schedule these, as I had mentioned, before the end of the month.
Great.
Okay. So next, I'm going to turn it over to Nova.
Super. Thank you, Jess, very much. So I understand that some of you might be curious about the costs of certification. And as we've mentioned in this program, the Regenerative Organic Alliance and NSF are striving to develop a structure that leverages as much as possible from those existing certifications and audits that you are already participating in. For the pilot, the certification bodies that we will be working with will only audit the unique and specific regenerative organic requirements that are not already met by those existing standards and audits that you undergo in each of the 3 pillar areas. And I believe Phil mentioned that the equivalencies, which will be published shortly, are going to be sent to each of you, and these unique regenerative organic practices will be clearly defined in those equivalency documents. So going back to the cost factor, this approach of streamlining the audit process should minimize the work needed during any on-site inspection as well as during the document review, and this should reduce the cost of the audit. That being said, there is a cost to having NSF, the certification bodies, and all of you participate. We are currently estimating that the cost of the pilot audits will be between $3,000 and $5,000, and we'll be going through a scoping exercise with each of you to determine that. I want to call out some of the factors that will determine the cost. Those are the acreage and the size of the operation at the farm level, as well as any secondary processing on the farm. Also, the number of sites to be audited. So if you have multiple farms in multiple locations or a group management system, for example, that will impact the cost. Also, the number of crops and animal species to be certified, as well as how many of those specific regenerative organic requirements need to be assessed. In other words, if you've got multiple existing certifications in each of the 3 pillar areas, the cost should be lower than for those of you who haven't already achieved, say, a certification in the social fairness arena. As just mentioned, these pilots are a learning experience, so we'll be estimating cost and we will only be billing for what is actually delivered. Overall, the goal is for the regenerative organic certification and audit to be simple and not duplicative, and we'd like to minimize the costs wherever possible. I also want to mention that the Regenerative Organic Alliance is working to set labeling fees for the brands that participate. Those have not been set. They will be set through a consultative process, and so for now we're just speaking to the cost of the audits and the cost for a farmer to obtain regenerative organic certification. Now we can move on to the next slide. Thank you. I also want to speak a bit about communication. Given your leadership, we very much want to share the news of your participation in all of our communications. So that's communications coming out of the Regenerative Organic Alliance as well as NSF. And I believe we've asked each of you already for your permission to do so. We also encourage you to spread the word as well. Our collective voices together will help to grow this regenerative organic movement so that we can all achieve greater impact. And we can pave the way for more farms and brands to join us through that communication. That being said, I'm sure that you've noticed how frequently this term regenerative is being used these days. In these pilots, in the Regenerative Organic Alliance, and among all of you, we want to distinguish the full potential of a holistic regenerative organic production system that benefits soil, animals, and communities. So we want to express the full meaning of regenerative organic. To do this skillfully, we need to use consistent messaging and language. So we've sent each of you a communications guide by email, and we encourage you to send any press releases or other announcements that you'd like to make into NSF so that we can review those and ensure we're all using the same language when we speak externally. We also ask that you not use the Regenerative Organic Certification logo until an official certificate has been issued. This will protect the integrity of the program for everyone involved. Again, there are other ways for you to communicate about your participation in the pilot without using that certification logo, and those are outlined in the communication guide. If you have any questions, please contact NSF with an example of what you wish to communicate, and we'll work with you to put that out. Also, I would say if any of you are planning any external communications over the next several months and you'd like to coordinate with the Regenerative Organic Alliance or NSF on a shared communication about that, we'd be interested to discuss that with you. Now let's move on to some next steps. As just mentioned, you'll be receiving training materials from NSF as well as invitations to webinars in each of the 3 pillar areas. So we'll have a webinar on soil health and all of the requirements within that module, which includes the soil testing that Phil Graves discussed earlier, a really important area I know many of you have questions about. We'll be diving into that in those webinars and in those training materials. Then we'll move on to a webinar in the animal welfare module. Again, as Phil mentioned, that module is really only applicable to those farms that are producing animal products and animals on a commercial basis. So only some of you will need to participate in that, but we invite everyone to listen in if you're interested. And finally, a webinar on the social fairness module. You will also be asked to schedule a call with NSF and your certification body. Jess went into the 5 certification bodies that we're already onboarding. So one of those will be on the call with us and with each of you. You can invite your whole team. There we'll get into any specific details about your operation. And we invite you to reread the Regenerative Organic Certification Framework. As Phil mentioned, there have been a lot of updates since it was first published in September. It's available on the Regen Organic website, and we ask that you read it. It's a fairly easy read as standards go. And if you have any questions, we invite you to email either Jessica Slomka or Jessica Evans. Their emails are up on screen here. And with that, I want to encourage each of you to take part in the best segment of this webinar, which is the question and answer session. We've got a lot of time left available to get into all of the questions and comments that you might have. I believe we're going to ask you to use the chat feature, which is on the right side. If you're with us online, you'll see a little chat button there. Feel free to chat in your questions, and we are going to start taking those among the collective experts on the call today. Also, if you have comments, we encourage you to chat those in. So I'll just give everyone a couple of minutes to do that. And I see a couple of questions coming in here. Could I ask that we advance to the next slide as well? Okay, good. I'm seeing a few questions coming in now. This is a good time to ask questions about the equivalencies, for example. As I mentioned, we will be publishing those shortly, and those will be available for everyone. That will drill down into what specifically is needed if you have certification in each of the pillar areas or if you don't. We're happy to discuss questions about any of the practice-based requirements in the soil health arena, for example. I know questions often come up there. Okay, so I'm going to get started. I believe most of these are going to be technical questions, so I'm going to ask the NSF team to jump in with a few of these first ones. Do you have a template designed for the Regenerative Organic Certification System Plan?
Hi, Nova. This is Jessica with NSF. So we are developing several plan templates, and so that will include soil management, animal welfare, and in all of the 3 pillars. So I think an overarching system would encompass all 3 areas. Absolutely.
Okay, another question, and this is about rotations on a farm and the scope of certification. Do all products from a rotation on a farm need to be certified, or can you choose only the ones that will have a market?
So for the pilot, we will have the opportunity to focus specifically on product lines. And that way we can trace those products through the entire supply chain when looking at the ROC compliance. And whether or not that impacts costs, absolutely. Through the pilot process, we will have a small scale scope in order to be able to fully implement the ROC process and throughout the farm, and then we will look at increasing the scope and making it more scalable once the program is fully launched.
Okay, I'm going to move on to a question. I believe Jeff is still on the line. I think this would be a nice one for you, Jeff, if you're able. And if not, I will invite either Phil Graves or the team from NSF to answer. This is a question about the crop rotations. So there are 3-year and 7-year crop rotations depending on which level of certification you're moving into. The question is, does that mean that the same crop can be taken again after that 3 or 7-year interval? This person writes that they work with small farmers who have a land size of about just 3 acres, and this type of rotation on the 3 and 7-year interval might be difficult. If multi-cropping is practiced, could this replace the crop rotation requirement?
Yeah, this is Jeff. I believe multi-cropping, as long as the crop isn't at the same place at the same time, could take the place of rotation. Otherwise, yeah, the idea would be that if you have a crop in one spot, it would not be there for another 3 years or 7 years, depending on that rotation.
Great. I would say this is, in particular, these types of issues are the areas where we expect to learn so much through the pilots and to adapt the standard over time so that it works in all of these diverse contexts around the world and with different cropping systems. So I'm going to move on to a couple of other questions.
Yeah, I should add that, with perennial crops, it's different because you don't rotate them. So
yeah,
we give some credence to that as well, because it could be some crops in rotation that are they're perennial in terms of like pasture or hay crops that would be there for multiple years within that rotation and would be harvested every year, even though it's the same hay crop.
Right. Okay, I'm going to, yeah, there was another question about perennials, so I think that we've covered that. But if any of you feel like you want to dive into the details more, we will be, as I mentioned, scheduling calls with each of you, and we can discuss your particular context. For example, when it comes to the crop rotations. So I'm going to try to address some questions in another area here. Here's one on the social fairness requirements. For the first year operations, I'm not sure I fully understand the question. Let me see here. For the first year operations, will we have multiple audits for organic, social justice, and possibly animal welfare, plus the ROC? Is the plan in the future to condense these into a single assessment? Okay. I think NSF is probably best to answer this one, but in short, the intent is to start out during the pilot phase and the early launch phase with only auditing the unique regenerative organic requirements for ROC on top of those certifications that you might have in each of the other areas, the organic, the social justice, and the animal welfare. However, in the future, we are intending to build out the infrastructure to be able to offer a single audit that covers all pillars. Again, that's something that we expect to learn more about as we go through the pilots and plan for the future. But I'll invite my colleagues from NSF to add any more detail there.
The only additional detail that I would add is that another approach is we will be looking to work with the certification bodies that are focused in organic, in social, in animal welfare specifically, and asking them to consider adding the additional ROC requirement to their specific audit. So there are three approaches that we will be using for the ROC program. And again, through the pilot process, we will be taking those learnings to see which is the most feasible and provides the most value to the certification customer.
Okay, I'm going to ask Jeff to answer one more question in the soil health area, and this is regarding tillage. This person writes, tillage should be infrequent. Please define infrequent and what is required for the bronze level and for the silver level.
Oh, golly, I knew somebody was going to get technical right away. I don't have the standard in front of me, but I believe we made some adjustments to the tillage language with the understanding that if the goal is to improve soil health and we recognize that tillage isn't always, but can be detrimental to the goals of building soil health, we want to reduce the amount of tillage that takes place within a given year or across the rotation. So I think that initially we said we could only till once every year or once every 3 years for primary tillage, but I believe that's been changed now. And with the bronze level, you can till. I guess it depends on the crop that you're doing as much as you have to. But the idea is to show, because the concept of the whole standard is geared towards continuous improvement, you have to document over time as you move into silver and gold what actions you're taking in the context of your entire farm management plan to reduce or eliminate tillage within the life cycle of the rotation.
Again, another area that we intend to learn more about as we go through the pilot process, and that I know the ROA board is watching closely and will continue to adapt as needed. However, this is one of the core tenets in the soil health pillar, because all of the research indicates that minimizing tillage helps to improve soil health and carbon sequestration. So I know there are a couple more questions on tillage, but I think I'd like to move on to one of the other pillar areas so that we can have a diverse range of topics covered here today. But we'll get back to those on an individual basis or perhaps later if we have time. There were a couple of questions around animal welfare, again, in different contexts. So there, I guess I just want to reiterate the point that the animal welfare pillar is only required if you are producing animals on a commercial scale on the farm. In other words, if you are only raising animals on the farm for personal use and not selling any of their materials, that pillar will not apply to you. So we won't be auditing to that criteria. I think there are a couple of other questions on animal welfare here. I want to capture those. There were some questions on animal identification techniques that are prohibited. This person asks, are there approved alternatives to marking animals? For example, alternatives to hot and cold branding, ear notching, etc. And I would invite either anyone from the ROA board or from NSF to help answer that question. I think we have a lot of flexibility in that area.
This is Will, and animal identification tags, both visual and electronic, are allowable.
Great. Okay, I think I'm going to move on to some questions in another area, and that's related to communications. I see a couple of questions here. Is communication sent out mentioning, if communication is sent out that mentions only the regenerative organic certification and includes processing for food products, how are processed food products going to be handled? I'm going to ask that person to clarify their question in the chat feature. I believe the intention there is so during the pilots, we'll be auditing at the farm level, and we won't be prepared to authorize communication around finished products because we most likely won't be issuing certificates on finished products during this early pilot process. We will be planning to do that early in 2019. But I'm going to invite that person to maybe clarify their question just a little bit more.
Nova, this is Phil. I'll jump in while they're clarifying. If the question centered on processing specifically, the guidance that the board has given is to lean on the USDA requirements for processing and follow those.
Right. So as we discussed earlier, there was a communications guide that was sent out to everyone. And currently the authorized communication for the Regenerative Organic Certification Program at the product level mirrors the USDA organic labeling guidelines in terms of made with claims, et cetera. So please refer to that, and we can provide some more detail on that as we move through the process. Okay. So I'm going to invite any of you who have questions to feel free to chat those in here. I'm moving through them. See if we can cover some other topics. Again, one on communication. Who is leading the ROC marketing and PR effort? I understand the initial pilot level requires the NSF sign off, but what is the long-term plan? For that one, I'm going to defer to the Regenerative Organic Alliance, maybe Phil Graves, maybe some of the board members. In terms of the long-term communications plan, I know that you've been doing very active marketing and communication through your independent organizations already and through the Regen Organic website.
That's right, Nova. This is Phil. I can jump in, and anyone from the board feel free to supplement as needed. So the communication strategy right now is for everybody that is intimately involved in ROC, whether they be on the board or ally, to communicate the merits of ROC through their own organizations and channels. We have come together at key trade shows and put booths out there, spread the environmental and social benefits of a new certification like this. But long term, the Regenerative Organic Alliance, which again is the nonprofit that holds ROC, will build out their team and ultimately take ownership of the communication strategy. So the communications aspect is key, as is the training aspect as well. And those will all be played out over time. So for now, just to recap, each organization that has gotten ROC to where it is today is working hard on their own ROC communications plan, specifically tied to their own products, et cetera. And then long-term, the Alliance, which is the nonprofit holder of ROC, will ultimately drive the communication strategy.
Thanks, Phil. So similar to how other certification programs work, you know, there are guidelines on the use of the logo, then there are guidelines on claims and statements that are made off packaging, and typically the standard holder, in this case the Regenerative Organic Alliance, manages a large part of the external marketing, but it's also carried through the strength of the communications of each of the participants and each of the certified entities, and that's what we tried to discuss earlier. We do encourage you to add your voices to help build the movement, but let's all try to use the same language and pave the way for more farms and brands to join us by using that full holistic sense of the term for regenerative organic production processes. Okay, let's see if there's some other questions here. Here's a specific one. If the farm operation is certified organic and 100% grass-fed and not a CAFO, does it still need additional certification for animal welfare? And I'm going to invite either members of the board or NSF to answer that one.
Yes. While grass-fed certification does have an component, it is not one of the animal welfare certifiers been recognized. One of the previously listed certifiers, which was GAP, the Global Animal Partnership Level 4, I think maybe Certified Humane, I think Animal Welfare Approved were among those that were recognized.
Thank you, Will.
And we'll be able to, this is Jessica with NSF, we'll be able to specifically highlight what those areas are in the information once the equivalency has been completed, and we can share those details with the participants.
Okay, I see a couple of other questions around the technical requirements. There's a few questions just around using tools to prepare for certification and for the pilot assessment. There have been some questions coming in around templates. Are there templates that can be used to capture the data in each of the 3 pillar areas? And are there any other tools like that that will be available for the pilots? I'm going to invite NSF to answer that one.
So we have kind of put together a summary, a toolkit per se, and so through the pilot process, we would like to work with all of the participants to determine what their needs are specifically. So we do have a couple of templates that we are finalizing, but if those don't suffice the need, then we will look to expand on those templates and tools for the program.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, we know that's a really important part of scalability. And so we want to focus those tools on those unique regenerative organic requirements that are not covered in any of the equivalent programs. But that being said, there are some commonly used tools and log templates and things like that. There's the regenerative organic farm plan, which we've rolled up into one cohesive document and things like that. So that's probably the shape that these tools will look like. That being said, if there's something that you already use that you find very effective, perhaps you're already doing some soil sampling and testing and you have a template for tracking that data, we'd be very interested in taking a look at that. And if you're willing, if that's something that seems like it would work for other participants, we'd be happy to work with you to use that as a tool in our toolkit. Okay. Going through some other questions here. There are a couple questions around cost. Someone asked if the cost estimate that we shared earlier is indicative of what the expected cost for certification will be after 2019. I think I will take that. We are estimating cost based on a fairly detailed evaluation of crops and animal species produced on the farm, the number of acres, the number of facilities that might be involved, and we're coming up with some recommendations around the cost framework that we'll be providing to the Regenerative Organic Alliance for the board to vote on. I do think those costs are indicative of the early phase of the program, but typically as these certification programs expand and scale, costs in the market start to go down. And so I want to point out that although we will be providing some guidelines on cost, ultimately when the program launches, it is the certification bodies that will be establishing their fee structure within those guidelines. So it's a little bit, it's the $3,000 to $5,000 mark is indicative of the early stages of the program, but it's quite possible that costs will go down in the future as the program scales. Okay. There was another question about costs, whether or not these costs were an annual estimate. The program is structured currently for there to be an annual renewal cycle. So again, working with the individual certification bodies, the expectation is that they will be issuing invoices for their audit and inspections on an annual basis. Again, that amount may go down in the future, but for now, if you're trying to budget, I would recommend doing that on an annual basis. Okay, I'm going to shift gears here. There's a couple of other good questions that go to processing. So someone is asking how to deal with co-manufacturing or contracted manufacturing facilities that are not under the full control of the participant. I'm going to invite NSF. Answer that one.
So we will be using the organic approach, the organic certification approach, to look at traceability controls in place at the manufacturing and processing level, or ROC compliant.
Okay. It looks like we're addressing most of the questions that have been typed in. We do have quite a bit more time for those of you who want to continue. So if you have any questions that you feel haven't been addressed and you've stayed silent up till now, please do chat those in and use the chat button on the right. Okay, there's another one here related to cost, but also related to the requirements in the soil health pillar. The person asks, does the estimated cost include soil testing costs, or will that be additional? Currently, the estimates that we shared with you do not include soil testing. Soil testing is what we consider the cost of compliance for the most part. So if you're thinking about payment of costs for tests that you would be doing on an ongoing basis, that's an internal cost. Those would not be billed separately by NSF or by any of the certification bodies.
Hi, Reggie. No, but this is Phil. Just to jump in on that point, we have looked at the cost of soil testing, and the answer, of course, is dependent on the size of the operation. The bigger the operation, the higher the cost. But on a per test basis, there's a Cornell University test that's fairly comprehensive that ranges from $100 to $150 per sample. And we are seeing also some free tests that are out there. So the goal would be to minimize that cost, but get high quality data that we can aggregate and track in the database that I mentioned earlier.
Okay, thank you, Phil. That's an important clarification. Okay, there's another one here about the scope and the timing of the audits. This person asks, does the certified crop need to be growing in the field at the time of audit? And I know that's a topic we've discussed a lot internally, so I'm going to invite my colleagues from NSF to answer. So does the certified crop need to be growing in the field at the time of the audit?
When we are conducting, sorry, I was on mute when I started to answer and realized I was still on mute. So the crop will need to be growing during the audit, absolutely. And there are other practices to put into place so we can start to monitor the soil health and start to implement some of the regenerative practices, but the crop will have to be audited in order to determine ROC compliance.
Yeah, so that goes into some of the scheduling that we'll be doing with each of you on an individual basis. And for some of you, if you've got crops growing in different regions of the world, the timing of those audits will be spaced out to follow the harvest seasons in those parts of the world. And that's pretty common at the agricultural audit level, so that's probably what you're doing with your current certifiers already. I know there are a couple of times when there are exceptions made. Again, this is a learning process, so if that becomes somehow burdensome, I think the ROA is open to looking at considerations for timing of the audit, but most of the agricultural standards require harvest to be observed, and it's important for the soil health pillar in particular. Okay. Looking to see if there are any additional questions here. All right, well, I think I'm not seeing any more questions come in, and I noticed that some of the participants have had to drop off. That being said, we do have time to continue, and I'm going to ask if anyone from NSF or the Regenerative Organic Alliance, Phil Graves, anyone would like to provide some comments based on the discussion so far. Anything that you'd like to add?
This is Jessica with NSF. I did want to let all of the participants know, as we had mentioned before, this is being recorded. This session is being recorded. So if your other team members are not able to make it, we will make it available and download it to you. We are also, we've recorded all of the questions that have been asked today, and so we will follow up with a summary of the questions and responses as a follow-up as well. So I did just want to mention that. But thank you all for a very active discussion. These are great questions, and again, this is a learning process, and we're excited to be on this journey with all of you.
Okay, I do see a couple of new questions that came in. So for those of you who want to continue, I'm going to invite Jeff to answer this one. Let me read it out. Jeff or Phil, actually. We do a lot of soil sampling prior to our fall compost applications. Would you recommend that we use the CASH protocols? That's the Cornell Comprehensive Assessment for Soil Health, and that's what's specified for soil sampling and testing in the appendix of the standard. For those of you who don't know it, that's the acronym used. It's called CASH. So this person is asking, would you recommend that we use the CASH method instead of our standard soil test labs in the coming months in an effort to fulfill the ROC requirements? So I guess the subtext there is, are we open to looking at other soil sampling and testing that these farms have already been doing that might not be specified in the standard? So Phil or Jeff, if you'd like to answer that one.
Sure, I can take it, and Jeff, jump in with any other thoughts. There is openness to using local testing labs. The test itself needs to capture the soil health indicators that are listed in the appendix on the framework, but we certainly can't have every global pilot send everything to Cornell for many reasons. So in the international pilots, thinking back on the slide where we saw these pilots occurring everywhere on the globe, basically, they will work with their local ag extension agencies, soil testing labs, but the key is measuring the same indicators the same way. So if you do have a local testing partner that you have a strong relationship with, we'd be happy to look at that, and ultimately, the more data points that come in, the better the ROC soil testing procedure itself will be. So we are open to that, and we'd be happy to talk further offline on it.
Great. Yeah, we're expecting to have a lot of dialogue on the soil sampling and testing methodology as we go through the pilots. And typically what happens is that there will be a process established for submitting a request for approval of a method that's not already specified in the standard. That being said, I just want to reinforce what Phil mentioned. What's so important is that we use methodology that is widely considered accurate, and that we're measuring some of the same key indicators so that we can aggregate and measure the total impact of these regenerative organic practices to communicate it out how powerful they are using the same data set. Okay, see if some other comments came in. Jeff, if you would like to take a question about tillage, there were questions that came in, actually a couple of questions that came in from operations in India, as well as some that are domestic, asking about the tillage, for example, tillage used for land preparation versus tillage that's used for weeding and intercultivation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
This is Phil. I think Jeff is off. So we have made an allowance for cultivation. I think that's what the question is getting at. So kind of preparation for planting of the seeds, and that would not be counted as tillage. That's cultivation. And circling back on Jeff's comment, tillage is a very tricky topic because it's very regionally sensitive, it's crop sensitive. And so in order to make the guidance less prescriptive and more accessible, we gave that language about tillage should be infrequent and should occur only when necessary, and documenting how often you're tilling, why you're tilling, how deep you're tilling. Those will all be instrumental in further refining the guidance going forward. For now, one of the things that we heard loud and clear is there's really not a reason to go deeper than 10 inches unless you're preparing the field for orchards, as I mentioned. But then to the specific point from our supply chain partner in India on cotton, cultivation would not count as tillage. And Jeff, if you are on, feel free to clarify, but that is my understanding.
Great. Thank you, Phil. Okay, there's another one here. This is related to the social fairness pillar. This person wants to confirm that for operations that are not currently undergoing a social justice audit, will they still be able to participate in the pilot? Or will we recommend that they contact one of the social fairness approved standard certification bodies right away to see if they can do that social justice audit prior to the ROC audit? I will invite NSF to answer that one. Yep. We're making allowances for all sort of different stages of certification. And so, Jess, maybe you want to answer that one.
Yes, absolutely. So for the social piece, if you are currently not participating in any program, I would recommend that you reach out to schedule a social audit. The ROC audit will be primarily focused on the add-ons in each of the three pillars. So we can work offline individually to customize whether or not we can have the add-ons included in the social audit. But yes, please reach out to the organizations that are highlighted in the equivalency to schedule a standard specifically on the social pillar.
And when we talk about the equivalency document, that document's going to clarify for everyone the requirements in each of the pillar areas that are unique to the Regenerative Organic Certification Program versus those requirements that are covered by one of these other standards. So that will be true in the social justice area as well. So if you're able to schedule an audit with one of those, an audit for one of those approved equivalent standards, that means your ROC pilot audit will be that much more streamlined. And some of the unique requirements in that social fairness area include, for example, the living wage calculation. It's covered by some of the equivalent programs, but not very widely. So that's just one area where there might be unique requirements. Okay, there's another question here. This is an important one. We really want to make this clear. If processing facilities are certified organic, will they require a separate ROC audit, given that the ROC leverages USDA National Organic Program requirements? So I'll invite Jess to hone in on that point again. It's a really important one.
So the ROC is leveraging NOP and other standards that are out in the marketplace currently. There are additional requirements that go above and beyond those standards, those certifications that are out there. So there would be an audit that would be required for those add-ons that would cover the ROC requirements.
And this ties in, this is Phil, to the supply chain slide that I spoke to earlier. And for, again, like most of these topics, they depend on the level that you are going after for your operation or for your brand. So for bronze and silver, those are required at the farm level, so no processing, but for the USDA organic requirements on processing. For gold, it's farm level, which is just like silver and bronze, but for gold, there is an incremental requirement to have at least one or more processing stages be ROC certified as well. So it is dependent, Jessica, that's well said, but it is also dependent on the tier of ROC that you're going after.
Thank you, Phil and Jessica. So there's a further question here. We probably will need to dig into this topic a bit more with each of you individually, but there's a question here about how that particular situation of auditing at the processing level will be handled when the products are manufactured by a contract manufacturer.
So this is Jessica with NSF. So there, we will be looking at the manufacturing process specifically with each of you and really diving into your supply chain. But there is an opportunity for products to be co-manufactured in a facility that does not have ROC certified products. So certified products versus non-certified products. There will have to be specific controls in place, chain of custody, traceability, strict segregation controls and requirements, and we will be providing details and guidance around those areas as part of our toolkit that will be forthcoming.
Okay, so I'm going to invite any of you to ask any further questions in the next couple of minutes, and then I believe that if we're winding down on the Q&A session, I'll just ask if there are any closing remarks from the Regenerative Organic Alliance, Phil, from the folks at NSF, and maybe we will wrap up just a bit early. So if you have any other questions, please chat them in now, and otherwise we will wrap up this webinar. Okay, I'm not seeing any come in. So I want to thank everyone who participated, everyone who joined in from long distance. This presentation will most definitely be made available to everyone. We'll create a PDF and we will email that out to each of you. Our sincere thanks go out to each and every one of you who've decided to join us in the pilot process for the Regenerative Organic Certification Program. You are part of co-creating this and building a better future. So we thank you for your leadership and your commitment to taking this journey to regenerative organic agriculture. And onwards, I just encourage us all to go forward with a very positive and flexible approach as we move through the pilots. And thank you all for your commitment. And please do look for a few emails from NSF over the next couple of weeks as we set up those webinars and the individual one-on-one calls. Thank you again.